did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to House of Asher.
And welcome to the show, everybody. This is Steve Asher. You are listening to House of Asher, and you may be hearing us on YouTube. And if so, please like and subscribe and share this with your buddies. You may be hearing this on, I don't know, iHeart, iCloud, Spotify, SoundCloud. Most likely, if you're off the or out of the 50 states, you may be listening to this through Paranormal UK Radio, paraukradio.com, and they are kind enough to simulcast me all through every point here, north, south, and all that, all the way around the globe. And I'm very thankful for those guys to do that. Also, please do check out Steve E. Asher. That's SteveEAsher.com. And to find out more about the show, to find out more about some of the books, including the Haunting series, and also go there to check out some of the stuff on the upcoming History from the Dark Side, which touches on a whole lot of like kooky, creepy, mainly Southern stuff. There's some stuff that's not necessarily Southern, but you know, I'm Southern, so it sort of works out that way. But man, you are in for a good show. We're going to have a guest here in a bit that's going to blow your mind. It's going to open you up and maybe make you rethink more about not just the deity of Christ, but the man that was Jesus Christ. And we will be right back to that right after this commercial break. Wild Hair Studios Rock Shop in Paducah, Kentucky has a lot to offer. Their tagline is positive energy that works, and it really is your one-source shop for healing crystals, aromatherapy, essential oils, unique stone jewelry, psychics, light work, chakra balancing, you name it. Even sound healing, everything. They offer it all, even classes in light work. And this is all located at 311 Broadway, very centrally located in Paducah, Kentucky. And you can also look them up on www.nicerockshop.com. Make sure to go in there and tell them that Steve sent you and get your enlightenment on. That is Wild Hair Studios Rock Shop in downtown Paducah, Kentucky. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you for sticking around. And as always, I appreciate you guys tuning in. What we're talking about tonight, let me pose a question, because this is sort of what our next guest did. If you could sit down with Jesus of Nazareth and talk with him, what would you want to know? What would you ask him? You know, interviewing Jesus is a poetic and insightful meditation on the lifetimes and sayings of Jesus of Nazareth. It is also considered a considerate reflection, on the human journey of divine transformation. And this book, Interviewing Jesus, the writer, David Collis, is here. Hey, Dave.
Hey, Steve.
Man, you know, it's so cool that you're here. And like I said, it's one of those things where it's so different, because so many people look at things in sort of a cookie cutter way, and that's just the nature of things. You know, people, I mean, the story of Christ is, 2,000 years old, and most people like boxing things in, and people like to kind of go, yeah, okay, this is what I'm comfortable with, this is where I'm at. Okay, I feel like this, and he feels like me. Everybody wants to say, okay, well, we're working on the same thing. I'm trying to be like Jesus, and that's cool. But when you look at the totality of the man, I don't want to necessarily say, like a Gnostic Christ, where he was more of a man with divinity thrust upon him. But some of the things that I had noticed was like one of your reviews was talking about, it said, this is a work of scholarship, imagination, and might I say a personal love and affection for his subject. So what made you write this?
Well, I have great grandparents that were, or grandfathers that were ministers. And I know that when I was young, I was going to the Episcopal Church, and then we kind of fell away from that. And then I ended up having, these mystical experiences. I've had an existential crisis, and I started asking questions like, who am I, and who is God, and what is the meaning of life? And I found Christianity helped provide me with some level of insights and solace to kind of the turmoil that was going on inside of me as I was transitioning from as a teenager into a young adult. And, that was a very scary time for me. It was a very difficult time for me. And I just found myself just really enjoying looking at the Old Testament. I felt like I had come home. I felt like I felt an akin to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I just really dug deep into it. And I found myself over the course of time wanting to know more about it and wanting to know more about the traditions. So I didn't want to just take everything as, quote, the Word of God and at face value. I wanted to kind of dig deeper into the subject. And so I spent some time studying what is referred to as the Christian mystics. So we'd look into, I read the books and the literature of St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross and men like that. And then from there, I ended up spending some time looking into what the early Christians were, because there was actually two branches of Christianity. There's kind of the type that you would recognize today, and we would call that as proto-Christian. But there was also another group of Christians that now the church really doesn't like to recognize or participate with and acknowledge, and that would be the Gnostics, but they were Christians. And so I looked into their material. And then when Dan Brown's book came out, The Da Vinci Code, there was a new kind of layer of trying to understand Jesus from a historical point of view and how Christianity developed and how it rose and what the conditions were in the first century. So I really wanted to kind of do more of a scholarship, kind of an investigation and exploration. And then after doing all of that, I had this like an epiphany. I had kind of a revelation, and I was reading the book of Thomas, which was it's all about Jesus. It's 114 sayings that Jesus said. And some of them, a third of them, are in the New Testament, and the others are not. But anyway, I had this opening. It's just like my mind just opened up, and I was able to understand almost all of the sayings. And prior to that, I couldn't. And if you read any of them, they're very, very difficult to look at and understand. But what happened with me is I started to see Jesus in a new light because of that. And then I went through a reevaluation of everything that I had read, everything I investigated, and everything that I've done, and all my travels. And I started to think about Jesus in a new way, and I started to want to understand him from a point of view that would be, say, non-traditional, or it doesn't really necessarily involve the salvation theology perspective of Jesus, that he was the Son of God, he died for your sins. I just was really interested in knowing, who was he, what did he do, what did he say, what were the circumstances, and what can I know about him as an individual that the church really isn't teaching. And so my book was an exploration into his life, his times, and his sayings.
Well, let me ask you this. I know for myself, like I said, I don't espouse to be especially religious. I hold to a lot of the tenets and you don't want to do bad to people. You don't want to murder people. You don't want to covet this and that from, just because, if nothing more, just for your own health, you need to be happy and pleased with what you got. Know there's people that have a lot less who's doing more than some of us may not be able to do. So,
yeah, those are more ethical. Those are more the ethical and moral teachings of Jesus.
Right. And I think that's what a lot of people, even if they're not of the faith, take from that. They'll have that sort of, well, of course, because it's like, what's the thing that says, yes, we are all different face, but there's also that element that we're all the same. Everybody has families and they want to see their kids grow up and do well and this and that, and all that stuff. You have money troubles, you have this and that, whatever the, whatever, you burnt dinner or whatever, and you're this and that. So you and your the wife and you were fighting or whatever, or that
that's
darn.
Right. We all have our trials and tribulations, and they're very unique to us.
Right. Well, what I'm thinking too is that it's just sort of like if you looked at an individual, say you're a sports guy and you were like a fan of like a great baseball player, and I know you'll just bear with me on this one, but when you're a little kid and you see that person, it's through a different set of eyes. When you're 20, it's a different set of eyes. When you're 35 or 40, it is. Then later in life, as you're getting closer to the passing, maybe your 60s, 70s, 80s, it seems like you're going to kind of see with new eyes, not just whatever your idols or your heroes and stuff, but also in a religious context. Do you feel that it took you to now? Which I'm not for sure on your age. I'm nearly 50. But did you feel that you could have not written this book in earnest in regards to as best as you feel that you have done, say when you were 25 or 30?
Yes. So somebody has asked me, well, how long did it take you to write the book? Well, it took me 12 months to write the book, and then I think another 6 or 7 or 8 months to edit the book. But it took over 30 years to research. And it wasn't a directed research. I wasn't looking to say I'm going to write a book about Jesus after I do all this research. It was just that I was interested in this material, and so I just kept on going down one avenue after another after another. And it took a long time for me to kind of recognize who I was looking at. And I finally kind of, like what you were saying, I finally realized that if I were to use a baseball term, Jesus is the MVP of the baseball league. And I thought, well, if he's this MVP of the baseball league, he had to have gone through a lot of different things that we don't see in his life to arrive at a position where baseball was his profession. And then once he was in that profession, he then did a number of things to actually, propel him up to the MVP. So I took a very different approach and point of view. Instead of saying Jesus is the Son of God and then he came down to earth, I looked at it from the opposite point of view. I said, what happens if you look at him from an evolutionary point of view in which he's going through his own transformation? What would have had to have happened for him to get to the point where he arrived at? And with that, I engineered his life kind of backwards. I reverse engineered him. And it was through his sayings that I was able to do that.
Well, I think that, part of it too is what was the old saying? It's like, okay, you have a yellow beetle, and then you drive through town, and then all of a sudden you notice all these yellow beetles that you never noticed it was there. I think passages and sayings and different things hit you at different times because I don't think it's anything about people necessarily being narcissistic, but you go there. It's like to look for answers, and depending on where you are, you're 7 years old. You're not going to, get passages talking about marriage and this and that and money and whatnot. So like when you're in the grind, 30, 35 years old, that's the sort of stuff that's probably going to hit you more, or maybe trying to be of a contrite spirit and be humble and be good and try to help other people. When you're in that cycle, you're there trying to do your best for your family, but a lot of times it can be cutthroat depending on what sort of work you do.
Right.
And I think it's very telling. And I think it would be the same with Jesus, the man.
Well, you raise a very interesting point, and that is because of this. I'm going to rephrase this a little bit. Because of my research, have I arrived at have I arrived at a new understanding of Jesus, and how do I feel about that? And when we look at Jesus saying that, he was the Son of God, and he took away the sins of mankind, and he was the Savior of the world, and he's the Messiah, those are all archetypes. Those are all symbols. Those are all things that we identify him with. But what happens when you start looking at him from the perspective of a human being who had to go through, this and then that and then this and that and that, and all of a sudden he's now having to make a choice, saying, I have something that I want to present to the world. I always felt that, and this is what I understand. He always felt that he wanted to do something, but at some point he decided he was going to do something. And he stepped out in faith to do it. And he did it as if he were an entrepreneur. And that was one of the big revelations that I had when I did a character analysis and a personality profile of him, is that he has an entrepreneur spirit in him. And so he took the Father and presented it to the world, and he kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it.
I wonder what you think about, because in regards to this type of question, and I wonder if you got this sort of questioning. Did you have anybody, and as you know, it doesn't matter. You could write the most glowing review about or book on a subject, and someone's got to have something to say about it. More often than not, was the responses from people pretty positive, or did you have a few people say, like, look, I think I know what you're doing here, but my beliefs is that Jesus was purely divine. There was really, which they say, Son of God, but they forget that he's also human. Did you ever have anybody
that's the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
The Nicene Creed came in the 4th century. So they had to reconcile all the different issues that were taking place in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East and in Egypt that were trying to grapple with the nature of Jesus. Was he man? Was he God? Was he only God? Was he only man? What is it? So the Nicene Creed and the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, the early 4th century, was trying to wrestle with these issues, and Constantine, who was the emperor at the time of the Roman Empire, he demanded that the bishops, all the bishops of Christianity, arrive at a conclusion so that they can take that and move it forward in the world. And so they had to develop this idea of him and codify that, and then from there, create the canon that we now have that pretty much substantiates what it is that they were attempting to accomplish. They went hand in hand. But before that, things were, I call it a zoo. There was all kinds of different animals and all kinds of different ways that people understood Jesus. So what we're seeing, when we look at Jesus, we're seeing Jesus primarily through the lens of the Council of Nicaea, and then later the final polishing during the Council of Trent, which was, I think, 375, so it's a later 4th century.
Well, do you think that they did a service, or do you think that they kind of hurt the real past of Jesus by making some of those changes?
Now we're really opening up a can of worms. Well, this is what I feel. So after I did all of my research, and I ended up doing, I started writing my book, and there was quite a bit of information that I was gathering, and I finally had to create a big whiteboard, and I had to create an Excel spreadsheet, and I had to lay out all these different components of Jesus' life. And from that, it was a real big insight to be able to look at something on a big chart and go, okay, what would be most likely to have happened? And then the questions really started to get absolutely specific. Like, if Jesus already understood who the Father was, why would he go to John the Baptist? Why would he need to get baptized? That doesn't make sense to me anymore. Oh, it's to receive the Holy Spirit. Well, I thought he was God. Right? So why would you need the infilling of the Holy Spirit? Unless something is going on with John that Jesus felt that he needed. Because Jesus already understood who the Father was.
Right.
So that made that question very, very pertinent to the way that I shaped my chapter on Jesus and John the Baptist. Because my feeling is that there are certain things that Jesus learned doing his ministry. But there was also a lot of information that Jesus brought to the table before he started his ministry. The question was, what did he bring to the table before he started his ministry, and what did he learn while he was ministering? And those are two very different questions, and they have two very different answers.
Well, let me ask you, in regards, you bringing up John the Baptist, how important to what we know now as modern Christianity was he? Because I knew it before Jesus began his missions and stuff, that John was like the big dude. I mean, he was sort of like the guy. You know, the Baptist aspect of that was, as I understood, really quite popular. And you know, was it sort of weird when Jesus kind of come online like that? Because I've heard everybody talk about that. Well, you know, John was like a cousin and was related to him, and that there was a lot of you know, like in the 12 apostles, that there was some of them were, you know, blood relations and whatnot. I wonder how much that affected how he operated. Which obviously, if you were talking about the need for water baptisms, it must have taken on some relatively important aspects of the teachings of John.
Right. And so the question is baptism what Jesus really got from this? So, I mean, if you were to think that how many people were being baptized before Jesus got baptized by John the Baptist? Jesus wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. So just because Jesus went to John the Baptist, then what? Jesus got filled with the Holy Spirit? That seemed kind of weird to me. What about the first person that got baptized by John? What about the last person? Were they filled with the Holy Spirit at that point? I don't know. That seemed, I didn't see that as logical at that point. However, that's not to say that what was going on is that there was something about John that was very specific that that Jesus ended up resonating with. And I think that John ended up becoming more of a mentor to Jesus in certain parts of what Jesus needed for his ministry.
Right.
And that was, I think, a level of conviction. So Jesus, if you kind of think about Jesus, Jesus is more of an intellectual, and he's very, very refined. He's very sensible. He's a genius. He really knows his material really, really well. And John the Baptist is more of he'd be like a mason. You know, Jesus would be like an architect, and John the Baptist had more of this physicality about him and a fire about him that was very different than, say, an intellectual. And I saw Jesus more in light of a genius who had to overcome the needs of his body. And John the Baptist, you know, just had this fire about him on what it is that he wanted to accomplish. And he set about doing it, and he did it in his way, which was through a form of baptism, a cleansing, of turning away, of repenting, knowing that, as he's saying, the kingdom of heaven is near, the kingdom of God is near. If you look at Paul's saying a very kind of similar thing. You know, the kingdom of heaven is, God. It's where we're going to go. Jesus, when he talks about the kingdom of heaven, Jesus is looking at things from a very different point of view. The kingdom of heaven is like these little children. The kingdom of heaven is like a strong man. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. The idea of the kingdom of heaven is not some place, and it's not something that's just around the corner. It seems to be something that's already present. The kingdom of heaven is inside of you. So.
Well, you know, see, to me, that kind of throws back to what I understand. I'm not a theologian. Definitely have not studied this as deeply as you, but that kind of jumps back to the Gnostic Christ to me. It sounds like to where, you know, the kingdom of God, like you said, the kingdom of God is within you, and it's so different because, you know, at the time, both him and John and all these guys were Jews, and you know they had a certain way, you know, kind of a hierarchy, just like, I mean, sort of similar to the Catholic Church in a way, but you know, those guys are really taking some chances, and which ultimately it cost him his life, but
yeah.
I mean, that was pretty bold. I mean, I knew there was a lot of different people that would street preachers and things, but
he's got that Old Testament kind of fire and brimstone, not Jesus, more like John the Baptist does. When I did the research into the first century Judea, there were 4 individuals that I found really, really fascinating to look at. And in the book of Acts, we see right when Jesus was born, somewhere around that time, there was a man by the name of Judas the Galilean. And Judas the Galilean was furious at the Jews for acquiescing to the Romans and to accepting the tax and accepting the census. And Judas the Galilean felt, because the Jews at that time, the Jews, he felt, were allowing themselves to be subject to a foreign power. And by giving up your freedom, he felt, this is Judas the Galilean, felt that those Jews living in Galilee should be killed because they're not willing to fight for their freedom. So he and his disciples went around and slaughtered people and burnt their houses down and killed all their livestock. And finally, he had to get put down by the Roman army and by I can't remember if it was Herod the Great or his son who ended up taking over. So anyway, it was a really bad deal. And you'll see Judas the Galilean's name mentioned twice in the book of Acts. And when I went, well, who is this guy? I had to go back and I had to read Josephus, who was a Jewish historian of the first century, and he laid out who Judas the Galilean was. And I kind of summarized what it is that he did. Now, this is what's really important to understand. Imagine 30 years later, Jesus is going around to the same villages that Judas the Galilean had already wiped out. So when Jesus says, I come in peace, that's what he meant, as opposed to a sword, So, again, on a historical kind of continuum, we're going to look at the Galilee in the first century, and we're going to see 4 big individuals. We're going to see Judas the Galilean, we're going to see John the Baptist, we're going to see Jesus, and we're going to see Josephus, the man who wrote this history. And he was a Pharisee, and he was part of the group that initiated the attack against the Roman legions in the year 66. So we have 4 individuals who were just real, aggressive, powerful men who really had a deep conviction as to who they believed God was and what they were supposed to do in a time of extraordinary turmoil. So one, Judas the Galilean, was about slaughtering the Jews for acquiescing to the Romans. We have Jesus, who comes in peace and compassion. We have John the Baptist, who is, baptizing people and saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. And then we have Josephus, who ends up acquiescing. Actually, what he did, he turned in and became a traitor to the Jews and became the court historian for the Romans. This is just remarkable to me.
It's so, like you said, it's so funny because people think there's like one or two. You've got the Jews, you have the 12, you have X amount of people. You have Pontius Pilate and different people like that. Key people that sometimes they don't take into consideration how many more players was going on. It's almost like I don't want to kind of downgrade it to like a soap or a type situation, but there was a lot more subplots going on, and I think
the subplots. This is what got really fascinating for me, because the subplots and all the other characters that were involved, and we're looking at the first century, so we're looking at the time of Jesus' birth, roughly, a few years before, and then we're going to go down to the point at which the temple is destroyed by the Romans. So that's in the year 70. But starting in the year 66 was the first insurrection, in which the first Roman legion was destroyed by the Jews up there in the Galilee. And boy, the Romans didn't think that was, they didn't like that at all. And so they ended up sending 2 of their most powerful Roman legions into Judea, one from Egypt and one from Syria, and did a pincer movement and destroyed everybody and everything. So at the end of the temple, when it was finally destroyed, and then Masada afterwards, a few years after, that's referred to as the end of the Second Temple period. So Jesus' time is the first century, but he's also right there at the very end of the Second Temple period. And that period of time is a very dynamic period. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of characters. So one of them is Herod the Great. He's half Arab. He's half Jew. Well, that makes him illegitimate. Well, that didn't go over well. And then you have the Romans coming in, and they had their own way of dealing with religions, and so they made it so that the high priests were constantly making, on a daily basis, sacrifices to Rome and to Caesar. Well, that didn't go over too well either. And then you have the Essenes out in the desert who said, we are the legitimate heirs to the throne of Aaron, or the sons of Zadok, they call them, that should be the rightful people performing these rituals. And when I was reading on the Essenes and looking at Jesus, I started to recognize that Jesus has a number of Essene elements to him. And so does John the Baptist. In fact, there's one scholar who believes that John the Baptist was actually a priest of the Essenes. And that makes complete sense to me. So we have Jesus as being just one of the influences of Jesus were the Essenes. But there was other things that Jesus was inspired by and that motivated him. And that was more of the backstory that became very, very intriguing to me as to where did he come up, or how did he come up with his sayings and his spiritual philosophy, and where does all that come from? We think just because he's the Son of God, it's all part of his own mind and what he's usually thinking about, but that's really not the case. What Jesus is inspired by and Jesus is influenced by is Greek philosophy, particularly more the mystical side of Greek philosophy. So the Father is a term that is also used by Pythagoras, and it means the one. That's interesting. Jesus' parables and his aphorisms, do to others as you would have them do unto you, when asked, what should we do about the coins? And Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is God's God. Those are all part of Greek rhetoric. It's how you tell stories, and it's how you deflect and deal with criticism and personal attacks. Jesus understood how to do both of those very well, and they both have very strong Greek element to that. Okay, well, what else is Jesus inspired by? Well, he's inspired by the Old Testament. He's Jewish. We're going to see his cultural influences in some of his sayings. But there's more. We're going to see Egyptian influences. We're going to see Buddhist influences. We're going to see Hindu influences. We're going to see Confucian influences. And we're going to see Taoist influences. Now, where the heck did he get all that? Right. It's direct quotes. Some of them are direct quotes. The golden rule, do to others as you would have them do unto you. You know what that is? That's Confucianism. It's a direct quote. Jesus' ministry that he conducted was a very Buddhist idea of eliminating the ego. It's the Buddhist concept that as you eliminate yourself, then the powers of the divine, the universal consciousness, enters into your body. Jesus referred to that as the Father. So as Jesus says, the less I become, the more the Father becomes. That's a Buddhist idea. So his ministry was actually, there's a dimension to it in which he was actually moving into the direction of trying to eliminate the ego. I find that very fascinating. How did he learn that? That's not a Jewish idea. When Jesus talks about consider the lilies of the field, that's Taoism.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you always they talk about there was so much of Jesus' life that hadn't been covered in the Bibles and whatever, and some of the teachings. There was so many years that he was sort of, AWOL.
Yeah, those are called the missing years.
Right. Which, I mean, you hear. I mean, I don't know where your head is on like the apocrypha and stuff like that books. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Like some
The
of the books.
Apocryphas.
Thank you. Yes, and
Hmm.
the Maccabees and things like that.
Yeah. Hmm.
But it seems like if he was to really be for everyone, it would make sense that he would travel to all the connecting lands of the Middle East and talk to a whole lot of different people and a whole lot of different
That's
cultures.
a very, very good point. If he is who he is supposed to have been, then wouldn't it be likely that he would be influenced by all these other cultures?
Would have to be. I mean, even trade there. I mean, because I think, okay, when I was a little kid, I thought, okay, little kid born in the manger. You heard the old story. They couldn't find anywhere to have the baby. Nobody would. There was no rooms. But then you hear some people says, well, I mean, Jesus' family actually was fairly well educated and somewhat affluent.
Yes.
So it
Yes.
kind of depends on who you talk to, and it's one of those sort of because people have this sort of totem of going, okay, no, this was him. He was little baby Jesus in a gold diaper, to kind of quote, what was it called? The name of that movie. Anyway, it was a goofy movie with Will Ferrell in it. Everyone has this sort of idealized Christ, and there's no room for anything, even if it's true. So how do you feel all that came together? Do you feel that he had been able to visit, like some of the great, like to say the great library out of Alexandria, or perhaps, or, was it, I know he studied in the temples when he was young and spoke to the learned men, but I wonder what happened next. I mean, where's your stance on that?
Okay, so one of the ways that I went about doing the work, aside from reading Jewish history and Greek history and Egyptian history and Roman history and Mediterranean history, I ended up, and that took a while, right? And then there's all the other metaphysical books and spiritual books that I had to read to understand, what is Buddhism and what is Taoism and what is Hinduism. I had to dive into the religions of the world, and which is why I'm able to see what it is that I'm seeing in Jesus, because there are the parallels. There, they just jumped off the pages. I could see it. So one of the things that I did to really try to understand Jesus is I ended up taking all of his sayings. Now, in the Gospel of Thomas, there are 114 sayings. There's really no description about anything that happened. It's just a complete book of 114 sayings of Jesus. So in the Gospels, we have a third of those sayings, but we also have Jesus went and he did this and he performed this and he said that to this person and he said this over here and then he went over there and then he walked on water. There's all these different stories that you see in the New Testament Gospels. But in the Gospel of Thomas, you don't have any. All you have are those sayings. So I decided that what I wanted to do is take all of his sayings that the scholars felt that are the most authentic of his and put them together into a master catalog. And then from there, decipher what it is that I'm looking at. So think of it this way. I came up, when I did all this, I had 25 pages of just Jesus' sayings, single-spaced. That's a lot. And that told me right then and there that there was no one person who was remembering this. There was somebody cataloging this. In fact, there probably was more than just one. The other thing that I did is I decided to break everything up into subject. So how many kingdom of heavens did he say? Oh, well, there are 22 with 9 themes. Jesus talks about money. Oh, turns out that's the number one subject that he talks about, money, treasure, the number one. And what's fascinating is when I even went deeper into that, I started noticing that Jesus has a very interesting understanding of finances. And the finances are it seems a little bit more, how would I say it? His understanding of finances exceeded a normal carpenter's understanding of things. So Jesus spoke about taxes and the good good laborers and managers and good managers and bad managers and capital investment and returns on investment. And there was a number of other ideas that he was presenting, and it's all about investment and what happens with your investments. He had a very strong understanding of how to put something together, and that this had to have either come from his family being merchants, his family being like plantation owners. Somebody, they were running some type of an estate and enterprise. His family was involved in this, and Jesus was also involved in this because he knew it in and out. The number two subject Jesus talked about was food. So money and food are his number one and number two themes, and then the kingdom of heaven came in third. So from there, I was able to determine the types of things that the type of personality he had, and the types of experiences that he had. And I can't say for certain what every single experience was, but I can definitely kind of narrow it down to certain things. So I believe that Jesus was born into a devoted and very pious family. I believe that they were wealthy and that they owned an estate and they grew agricultural products. I also believe that there was a merchant element to them because Jesus is out looking for opportunities when he is conducting his ministry, and merchants are always looking for opportunities to sell their ware. Jesus is doing the same thing with the Father. And this family also had some building involvement with building. Jesus had a very strong sense of destiny, so did his parents, and that he was going to do something special. I believe that Jesus, from the time, somewhere between the age of 14 and 17, Jesus left home. And we don't know exactly where he went. Some people say that he went to the east. That wouldn't surprise me based off of the influences that I've been able to pinpoint that have Eastern religions to them, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, or Confucianism.
Right.
Jesus studied and he learned and he practiced a great deal of spiritual knowledge. And then I believe that there's been a number of very profound experiences that Jesus had, and I've been able to identify at least 4. So I can't tell you exactly when these occurred, but I believe that they occurred before his ministry, and I don't know exactly in what order. But there is, Jesus experienced some type of enlightenment. Jesus was robbed and he was beaten. Jesus had some kind of sexual encounter that shamed him greatly. Oh. And Jesus then kind of fell, what we would refer to as fell from grace, and that he experienced the pit of humanity and became, he kind of sank into a proverbial hell, and then was able to climb out of that. And
David?
Then he finally was able to return home, but he wasn't, some of his family didn't fully embrace him back into the fold.
David, we're going to pause real quick because I wanted to, you were mentioning selling wares, and I have to run this commercial break real quick. Everybody, we're talking with David Collis, the book, Interviewing Jesus, the Man. You can find this on Barnes & Noble. You can find it on Amazon.com. You can also find it more information at davidcollis.com, and we will be right back after this short break. Wild Hair Studios Rock Shop in Paducah, Kentucky has a lot to offer. Their tagline is positive energy that works, and it really is your one-source shop for healing crystals, aromatherapy, essential oils, unique stone jewelry, psychics, light work, chakra balancing, you name it. Even sound healing, everything. They offer it all. Even classes in light work. And this is all located at 311 Broadway, very centrally located in Paducah, Kentucky. And you can also look them up on www.nicerockshop.com. Make sure to go in there and tell them that Steve sent you and get your enlightenment on. That is Wild Hair Studios Rock Shop in downtown Paducah, Kentucky. We're back, everybody. Sorry, I didn't hit my mute button back. Everybody, thank you for staying on here and listening to us here at the House of Asher. We're talking with David Collis about his book. You had threw out some kind of heavy-duty things right before we went to commercial. I was going to ask you about when you were talking about, and I hate to be kind of salacious, but there's a point that I'm curious about. When you talked about there was a certain physical element, a sexual element on some level, was this like a by choice thing? Was he attacked sexually? Was he raped, or were some people trying to like bring him down from his position by kind of thrusting certain situations on him? What happened?
Well, I can't say. I know that in the prodigal son, first of all, I'd like to kind of go back just as to why it is that I think this. One of the things that I realized, and this is very, very important, when Jesus speaks, he speaks from a position of knowing. He speaks from a position of power. Jesus doesn't intellectualize. Well, he doesn't say, well, I kind of think it's like this. Jesus is always speaking from a position of intimacy. He knows the material in and out. The other point to understand about Jesus is that what he is telling us in his parables and in his aphorisms are autobiographical. So there is a great deal of the material that Jesus is drawing from that comes from his own life. Now, Jesus is smart enough, because he's able to do this, and this is what was really important for me to understand, is that Jesus was able to look at his society, and he was able to create these sayings, these wisdom sayings, in which he put things together so that people can understand what it is that he was talking about, at least in some part. Because when you get into the Gospel of Thomas, boy, if you just open up that book and you start reading it, you're going, what the heck is he even talking about? But for the most part, when you get into the Gospel, the New Testament Gospels, information is much easier to try to understand. In fact, this is one of the things that's so remarkable about the New Testament is that most everything that Jesus said in the New Testament is very palatable. You can totally understand it. It might be really difficult to execute, like turn the other cheek, and when somebody robs you, give them the other, your coat, and things like that. But there's an element of Jesus that when he is talking to people, he is telling them a very intimate understanding about the divine and human nature. And this is, we all know, I know, from just because we've now spent a lot of time on the earth, that normally people are going to tell they're going to have wisdom because they've had so many experiences. And so when I was reading when I put all of those sayings together, those 25 pages, I realized right off the bat what I was looking at was Jesus' life. He was telling me what happened in his life. So the idea of he talks about, in fact, I can't remember, I think it's like 6 times he has stories about robberies and thievery and being beaten. And I thought, wow, you know what? This is a little bit too familiar. Something happened to him that made him talk about this, and it comes from a firsthand experience. The other one is in the prodigal son, we hear his brother saying, oh, yeah, and he had all these relationships with women. And that makes sense to me that something would have happened that would have shamed him, and he now had to grapple with the element of shame. Then there's also the theme in Christianity that dealing with lost and found. And I asked myself, how would you know that unless that happened to you? So, again, I kept going back to this question. If you're telling me this, are you also telling me something that happened to you? And invariably, I kept going back and saying, this happened to him. Because one of Jesus' personality is that he's not a moralist. He doesn't say, do this and do that. He's always telling you, do something, because he himself is doing the very same thing. So Jesus is very authentic in that. And, in fact, his followers, after he died, epitomized him as Sophia, the personification of wisdom, because what he said and what he did were congruent. They were tied together. He wasn't saying one thing out of his mouth on this and then saying something out of his mouth on something else. And he was always walking the walk and talking the talk. He did both. So there was an authenticity. There was something very authentic. There was something very intimate about his wisdom. And from there, I was able to put together those different experiences that he had. So one of the things that also I had to grapple with was the idea that Jesus had, there are 5 components that I had to answer, and how can he arrive at these conclusions? So Jesus has this razor-sharp mind and intellect, and he has this very open mind. He's talking about some very big ideas. Jesus has an open heart. Well, you, after I've talked with you a little bit, you have a very big heart. Well, what do you have to do to have a very open heart? Jesus was able to perform miracles. Jesus overcame the needs of the body. I mean, why else would you go out into the desert for 40 days without anything to eat? I mean, that's a physical feat that very few people are capable of doing. And then the last one is that Jesus is very brave, and he's courageous, and he's fearless. Well, how do you get to that point? So there seems to have been some type of profound experiences that opened him up for each one of those. And this enlightenment was one idea that I explored. I also explored a near-death experience, but there seemed to have been some very, very profound experiences that he had. And all those experiences that he had that are written about in the New Testament and the Gospels, the transfiguration, and then the angels appearing to him and helping him after his temptations out in the desert, I went, okay, that wasn't the first time he was having those type of experiences. He had those before he even started his ministry. He had to. So.
Okay, well, let me ask you this, because there was a few things I was going to hit before we got totally through to the show, because like I said, we've probably got about 8 minutes. I was looking on your page, and everybody should check it out, davidcollis.com. Man, you're actually a very talented artist as well.
Yes.
I did not expect this. Not that I
yeah.
like this slob over here. I'm not saying that, but it was just like, if people will go check it out again, davidcollis.com. It's interesting, and we can talk a little bit more about Jesus in the book if you want. But I was just saying, it's got it's a very strange thing, because I look at it and I was like, well, some of it's almost symmetrical, almost mirror image, but some of it's very not that.
Yeah.
Where did this come from? Because what I'm asking is, I know some people who espouse doing, like, say, automatic writing or something like that. I don't try to do that, but like, say, when I'm writing, and I'm sure you get into that zone, and you're typing away, and you caught that third rail, you caught that spark, that heat, and you run with the story. And sometimes it feels like they almost come out of nowhere. What's going on with this artwork? Because it's interesting.
Well, there's 2 types. There's the paintings I've been working on, and then there's also the series of graphic symbols that I created, which are about 1,000 of them. So on the website, I only have a few, and each of those, I'll just talk about the symbols. So I call them the mystery symbols, or the sacred symbols, and these images, there were times when they would appear to me at 1 o'clock in the morning. So I would have to, it's just like I was rattled out of bed, and I would have to start drawing these, and I would just start, writing them down or drawing them or doodling them, and I'd have to do that for 2 hours. And then I'd have to get up and go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5:30. So there was a period of time when those images were just pouring out of me, and a lot of them came at night. And so what I would start with is like a part of one of those drawings, and then from there I would expand on the drawing, or as I was drawing one, it seemed as if I were pulling, as I was drawing out from, drawing the one image, then I was like pulling another image out, and then I can see another image in my mind, and then another, and then another, and another. And so I was just in a real creative and revelatory space when I was doing that work. It was really quite phenomenal. And those symbols, there was kind of a period in which they ended, but earlier this year I ended up creating 2 more, and I'm really excited about those. And then when it comes to the painting, I was looking at, in modern art, there was the idea of the machine and the system creates and generates the artwork. And I was trying to explore in that work how certain systems can create imagery. And so I was looking from the mystery symbols, how to create shape from one point of view, and then in my paintings, I was kind of shifting that point of view to look at another, look down at another avenue. And I explored both of those tendencies.
Well, I'm sorry to jump in on this, but because I've checked out like the mystery symbols and some of the sculptures and a lot of that, and it's strange. It's almost got kind of a glyph quality to it. Do you think that, and I don't know what your belief system is on some of this, but do you think due to the fact that you were following so closely and trying to do this thing with Jesus, do you feel that you could have possibly been contacted by angels? I mean, some of it's almost got sort of an angelic script quality to it. It's interesting.
I am completely convinced that there is information that's coming into those symbols that is more than just who I am. In fact, not only was that coming to me, and some of it, there's part of my personality. This is where it gets very interesting. Personalities are part and parcel of how the divine comes through you. So it's not like you're a secretary and you're just dictating, what the boss is telling you. No, there's a part of your personality that is directly tied into this information, and it's the deepest aspect of yourself. At the same time, there's another part to it, but they seem to be meshing. It's hard to explain how that is, but that's what I believe. The other part is when I was writing the book, I would spend 5, 6, 7, 8 hours on it. And then the next day I would go back and I'd read what I wrote. And I would read it and go, I don't remember writing any of this. And that happened more than once.
Well,
then there was one experience that happened when I wrote about Jesus' experience out in the desert, and it's a type of sensory deprivation experience that he had. And so I wrote about it, and I got done, and I was eating dinner, and I had this little voice in my head saying, "You got all that wrong. Tomorrow, rewrite it and rethink that." So yeah, I think there is some element that, angelic language, an element of angels coming through me or Jesus coming through me. Yeah, there's a number of things that are coming through me, and I can say that I am enhanced because I do it, but I also recognize that there is something else that's driving this.
Well, I know that
I'm seeing something.
I was going to say, I know from listening to and speaking with religious people like Father Malachi Martin, talks about the more that you try to do something that's devout, so you try to do something that's wholesome. It's sometimes things get thrown in your, roadblocks get thrown up or whatever. Maybe you're not even thinking about some thing that kind of takes you down another road or tries to get your attention or whatever. You've got to get to an interview. Boom! Of course, you're going to have a tire blowout, or you're going to have some car issue, and maybe after the interview's gone, boom, the car works fine. Weird, unexplainable, almost paranormal. I'm sure you've had to experience that.
I've had hundreds.
Yeah. For some reason, I felt that. Again, like I said, I'm not psychic or anything like that, but I just got that feeling. because
Well,
I've seen it with other people.
I characterize myself as an artist, a mystic, and a builder. And when I was writing the book, all three of those were coming through me. So when I was thinking in a nuts and bolts way, how does Jesus construct the ministry? You know, what are the nuts and bolts of it? What are the nuts and bolts of having these types of experiences that he can talk about? You know, the kingdom of heaven being like a mustard seed, or these little children, or a strong man, or all the other, themes that he used. So, yeah, it was a very sobering kind of experience to write his story, at least from my perspective as an artist and as a mystic and as a builder, because Jesus had all three of those characteristics as well. You know, when he's composing, you have to remember, Jesus is always composing his parables and his aphorisms. That's a form of a writer or a form of a poet. So there's an artist side to him. It just happens to be a verbal artist. I'm a visual artist. So I see things and I build things, and I, move in the world in that direction. Whereas Jesus is using his power of the mind and his experiences to draw from this like infinite well of the kingdom of heaven.
Well, Dave, let me ask you this.
He's doing it very poetically.
Well, let me ask you this, because we're kind of in that down slide. I'm going to get ready to do an outro in a minute, but what do you have next going on? What's your next thing that you're going to jump on, or what is your thing that you are doing in regards of maybe in connection with this book that you are pushing out further out into different areas?
Well, I totally feel that understanding Jesus from a new perspective is absolutely essential. I've been working through the idea of like how, when I researched my book, I was noticing how religions emerge, and I'm noticing that, we're in a very similar cauldron, so to speak, in which there might be a new religion coming into the world, and I've been paying attention to how that works. I've been doing some writing, but for the most part, I kind of kicked back into the mystery symbols. I'm not necessarily making the symbols like I did before, but I've really been focused in on a new body of work that has captured my imagination, and I've been running full steam ahead with that.
Well, I say embrace it. I mean, it's one of those things where I'm again. I say I'm not very religious, but then I talk about like that still quiet voice. Don't overthink
it's
it
there.
And be kind of in the
Yeah,
moment.
don't overthink it.
Yeah.
That's right. Don't overthink it. That's been one of the biggest learning experiences I've had. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. And what's this? What does that mean? Just spend some time with it and let your mind unravel the mystery behind it. We all want, definite answers, but some of the work that I've been doing takes a great deal of pondering. You have to spend time with it.
Right. And
sometimes, don't be afraid to allow that to happen.
Right. And sometimes the questions you get, at the time you want them, you can't quite conceive it 100%. And
that's right.
It comes
exactly.
Yeah. Well, David, I appreciate you being on. Man, it was a real honor. I want to have you back on to talk about some more stuff in a few months if you so choose. But
let's do it. Let's do it. I love the way that you presented information and you ask questions. It's very natural.
Well, like I said, I try to do things, as I told you off the air, as close as just sitting at a table, sipping some tea and just talking. I understand the need for very quick clips and 5 or 6 different commercials and 5 or 6 different things, but I feel like I strangle the interview when I do that. I feel like I do it a disservice, and I want it to. It's kind of like whatever, maybe like a wine. You want to let it breathe. A steak before you cook it. You want to let it air. You want to let it, grow into what it's going to be.
When I wrote my book, I had to think about what it is, how I wanted to present this information. And I finally realized that the best way to present this information is if I were having a conversation with Jesus. And so I put the setting in my living room. And he was on one side of the coffee table and I'm on the other, and we're both having like a coffee talk.
Yeah.
That's how, just like what you and I are doing right now. That's what I wanted to do.
Well,
and when I wrote the book, I
thing.
envisioned myself as if I were a documentarian, and I had a camera, and I was just following Jesus along.
That's awesome.
What did it sound like? What did it feel like? What did it look like? What was going on? You know? So when you read the New Testament Gospels, it's kind of the intimacy of what was going on at that moment is lost because they're really talking on a theological level. But I really wanted to get down in that nuts and bolts. You know, what was it like, you know, walking, 15 miles a day?
Yeah, exactly.
What did you guys talk about?
Right.
You know, and who was with you? What's going on? And what happened when you'd go into that city, that other town over there? Mm-hmm. And that town happened to be, destroyed 30 years earlier by a former a rabbi or a Pharisee who went on a rampage. What would that be like?
Yeah, that emotional baggage you carry through and all that as well. Well, David, I hate to cut it off, man, but we're right at that point.
Okay.
But I will want to have you back on soon. And if you'll hang out for a quick second after this outro, I'll be glad to have some important words with you.
Great.
Absolutely. There we are, folks. This is it was really kind of an interesting thing because I did not know where this was going to go with David Collis. Again, interviewing Jesus, the man, David Collis. You can find this on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble. You can find out more information at davidcollis.com. But depending on where you are in the world, I want you to be able to go out and enjoy the rest of that sunshine. Go out there and enjoy that. But remember, as the sun sets behind the pines and the shadows grow long, make sure to check under your bed, back behind your closet, out in that back field some which way. There may be something unusual, might be something strange, maybe even a little scary, but sometimes there's things to be learned in fear, and we're all safe. Truly, learning is always a reward and a protection in itself. But until next time, everybody, we love you here at the House of Asher. Please love one another, and until next time, stay scared, everybody.